Hello, friends. Sorry I can't be there today. I hope you are enjoying your Friday. I have a short little lecture for you on monopolies, and on income inequality. So let's jump into our final couple of market failures and the final couple of concepts for microeconomics. We are almost done. So here we go. Monopolies as market failures. Monopoly, we know that we fight against monopolies pretty vehemently here in the United States. And the main method that we use is something called an antitrust law. And this is the idea that all monopolies are actually supposed to be prevented. And the reason we prevent them is because we want to promote competition. We want to keep prices low, keep quality high, right? So it's very, very important to ensure that no one business gets complete control over a product market, because it can harm all of those things. So we use antitrust laws in most cases to eliminate these market failures, unless we have a natural monopoly, which we're going to show here in a second. So why are monopolies a market failure? It's simple. They're a market failure because they're inefficient, right? There's deadweight loss. They destroy competition. They literally make it so that no other business can compete in that marketplace. And as a result, the quality is down. The quantity that they produce is less than what is socially optimal. The price that they charge is higher than is socially optimal. And so the consumers lose in the end. So that's why the government gets involved. And again, with the exception of a natural monopoly, antitrust laws. Eliminate them, get rid of them, literally break them up into several new companies instead of allowing them to continue to gain more and more and more power. So we are very anti monopoly in the United States as a result of this reality of it being a market failure. Right? So we do regulate some of them. Specifically, the ones we regulate are the natural monopolies. So make sure you write that down. You know this already, but natural monopolies are the ones that we regulate. We keep them around because at the socially optimal quantity, the average total cost is still falling. What does that mean? That means that they can produce the quantity society wants at the lowest possible cost. It doesn't make sense to invite more competition. They can actually provide everything society needs, and because of their incredible economies of scale, is going to cost the fewest amount of resources. In other words, it is more efficient to keep them around than not. But just because they can produce at the socially optimal amount does not mean they are going to. So that's where government regulation steps in. And the goal is to make this market efficient and to keep prices low for consumers. Twofold goal to fix those problems. And the way that they do this is through the price ceiling mechanism, which we've talked about before. We use price ceiling, not taxes like we do with a negative externality or subsidies like we do with the positive externality, but a price ceiling, because a price ceiling forces the business to sell the good for a lower price. And the reason we don't do it with taxes is because that actually exacerbates our problem. It means that when we tax something, we decrease the quantity that is being provided to society. Now, that's ideal with a negative externality. When something is having a negative impact on society, a lower quantity is what we want. But with a monopoly, we actually want a higher quantity. Remember, one of the reasons there are market failures are producing too little. So a tax will not provide that for us. It will limit our supply and reduce our quantity. So instead, we use price ceilings. We have two places we can put the price ceiling. The first is at the socially optimal price. This is where there's going to be allocative efficiency, where price is equal to the marginal cost curve, and I'll show that to you in a second. But normally, we don't actually get to allocative efficiency. We don't do the socially optimal quantity because it will create a loss. And when there's no other businesses to exit the market to eliminate that loss, when there's only one, right, that loss will be persistent, and then the government will have to subsidize in order to accommodate that loss. And now we have a weird scenario where the government is making sure that a monopoly is making a normal profit. Weird stuff. Okay. The other one is a fair return, much more common. A fair return price is where we put the price at the average total cost. And this gives us zero economic profit or a normal profit for the businesses. It lowers the price, but not as much as allocative efficiency would. And it increases the quantity, but not all the way up to socially optimal. So it's better, it's not best, but it doesn't require a subsidy because the business is still making a normal profit. So let's take a look at it. This should look very familiar to you. Here we have a natural monopoly, and we see that at the sneaky supply equals demand, socially optimal quantity, average total cost is still falling. We know that because it doesn't intersect our marginal cost curve until over here to the right. So as a result, they can produce a socially optimal quantity at the lowest possible cost using the fewest amount of resources. So we should keep it around, but regulate it, because we know if we don't regulate it, right, if there's no regulation, we'll jump right here. If there's no regulation, then they're going to produce where MR equals MC, and they're going to charge a price way up here at demand, right? So they're going to produce a quantity that's way lower than our socially optimal, which is way over here, and charge a price that's way higher than the socially optimal price, which is down here, right? Big deal. So we have other options. We can put a fair return price ceiling in. This would be a price ceiling, completely horizontal right there, right? At the intersection of demand and average total cost. At this point, our total revenue, which will be price times quantity, and total cost, which will be ATC times quantity, is the same, meaning we have zero economic profit, and that firm is experiencing a normal profit. Notice the price is lower. Get a little pen here. The price is lower than it was before, but not all the way down to the socially optimal. And the quantity is higher than it was before, but not all the way to socially optimal. So it's better, it's not best, but it doesn't result in a loss. The firm is still taking home a normal profit. So then we could also, if we desired, put a price ceiling here at the socially optimal quantity, where the ceiling intersects marginal cost and demand. In other words, we force them to produce at the socially optimal quantity, where sneaky supply, which is marginal cost, is equal to demand. So when we put a price ceiling there, notice that our price times quantity, total revenue, is this box here. But total cost, we go up until we hit the average total cost curve. It's going to be up here. Costs are greater than revenue. The firm is experiencing a loss, and we'll have to subsidize it to take care of it. So that's a natural monopoly. We already talked about it, but we're throwing it in here because it's really important to identify as a market failure. All right, final concept. Here we go. Unfair distribution of income. I'll try to make this quick because we don't really talk about it a whole lot in economics or in the exam. So it's not really the most important thing. There's only a few questions on the test, if we're being honest. But here we go. Income inequality is considered a market failure, right? Because it is one of the biggest critiques of a free market economy, is that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, right? This isolation of the wealth with the top 5%, for example, or 1%, is a big deal. And so let's break it down. First, the GDP per capita, which we use to determine the quality of life, is actually inaccurate. That just divides our GDP by our entire population and assumes that everybody gets an equal share of the wealth generated by GDP. But of course, that's not true. Income oftentimes becomes concentrated with a small portion of the population, the people who can win, for example, in this marketplace. So the government, in order to figure this out, divides our society into 5 groups of people. We call them quintiles based on poverty, right? So 20% represents each group, each quintile. So the first quintile is 20% of the population. So 5 times 20 is 100%. That's why we have it in 5 groups. And perfect equality means that 20% of our population receives 20% of the income. If that happens, if every quintile has 25 or 20% of the income, then they all have an equal share of our income. And then the government will step in and say, okay, how far from that equality are we? If the first quintile only has 3% of the income, for example, then we have a lot of inequality, and they'll step in to try and redistribute funds. So let's look at this in graph form. We actually use something called the Lorenz curve for this, Lorenz curve or Lorenz curve, depending on how you want to pronounce that. If your name's Lauren, you might want to go with Lorenz curve. So here's our Lorenz curve right here. This is perfect equality, right? So we have a box, which is a little weird. We haven't had a box in any of these, but we have a box with a line diagonal through it. And we have our quintile, our 20% of families. So each of these is a quintile. So 0 to 20% is the first quintile. 20 to 40% is the second quintile. 40 to 60 is the third. 60 to 80 is the fourth. And 80 to 100 is the fifth. Those are our quintiles. We're going to pop them in here. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Very good. So how much of the income does this quintile get? So we just dash up. And over here, it shows a percentage of income. So I dash over and look at this. This first quintile gets 0 to 20%, or a full 20% of the income. What about the second quintile? Second quintile, right here, also, my dots can line up, gets 20%. The third quintile, up here, boop, right here, they also get 20%. The fourth quintile, 20%. The fifth quintile, 20%, right? That's perfect equality, meaning every single quintile is getting 20% of the total income. So total equality is shown by this curve right here being perfectly diagonal between, or at the square, taking the square or rectangle and dividing it into two triangles. That's perfect equality on the Lorenz curve. Okay, hopefully that makes some sense. Let's look at the next one. This is showing inequality, actual distribution on the Lorenz curve, right? So we still have our perfect equality reference point. That's important because it shows us the difference between where we are and where we want to be. Now currently here, we can see our first quintile, 0 to 20, only gets 0 to like, I don't know, what, 3? Only gets like 3% of the total income. That's very little for the first quintile. Notice the second quintile, we go from 40, we go up until we hit right here. We go over, they get the rest of that, which is like what, 17? And then the third quintile, 40 to 60, they go from 20 up here to like 36 or something like that. So they might also get like 17. And then the next quintile, 60 to 80, we dash up there, they get what looks to be about 20, right? And then the final quintile goes from like 55 all the way to 100. They're getting like 45. I don't know if those numbers work out, but whatever. Right? They get like 45% of the income. This is inequality. The most impoverished of the families, the first quintile, is getting very little income, while the most wealthy, the fifth quintile, is getting an entire 45% of the income. In fact, the distance between this bowed curve and the perfect diagonal demonstrates inequality for us, okay? So we can actually fill it in. The shape of this, right, the hammock, for example, the larger it is, or the larger the half circle is, the more inequality we have. The closer it is to our actual perfectly equality reference line, then the more equal it is, right? So that is the Lorenz curve. So oftentimes you'll see it like this, where we have our area A and area B, and this gives us a Gini coefficient. The Gini coefficient is a statistical measure of the distribution of income, right? And it's simply the area of A divided by the area of B. Now here's the good news. Don't actually have to know that. It's just interesting information. They take the area here divided by the total area here, and that gives us an idea of how unequal we are. If the area A divided by area B is 0, right? If it's 0, if all of area A is area B, so area B is 0, then we have perfect equality, right? Meaning the full thing, we have 0 inequality there. But if it's 1 or 100, if area B, or if area A is all of it, then of course we have 100 is the absolute worst. So what do you need to know? You know the higher the Gini coefficient, the closer it is to 1, the more unequal our society is, the more unfairly it's distributed, the larger this Lorenz curve area is, and the more urgent it is to come in with a redistribution strategy. Okay, so that's income inequality. Now, what the government does is government steps in and does something called progressive taxing and transfer payments, which I'm going to talk about in a second. And in doing so, they shrink the hammock or the half circle. They shrink it down a little bit. When they shrink it down, you can see that we are now a little closer to perfect equality than we were before. We decided that this large area A here was unsustainable. It's bad for our economy. We don't want the top percentage to have that large of a portion of the income of our entire economy. And so we step in and do methods to try and shrink that down, get us closer to perfect equality. Okay? So Here's just a little map of the Gini coefficient. Here they didn't use it as 0 to 1. They actually converted it to percentages, which is fine. But notice the higher it is, the worse off it is, right? The closer it is to 100% or the closer it is to 1, the worse off it is. So our best ones, we got some European countries here that are pretty close on income inequality, right? Notice they're not nearly at 0, but they're a lot better. The United States is right here in the middle, 40 to 45. And then we have sub-Saharan Africa nations where the income inequality is really, really stark, where the poor are really, really poor and the wealthy are very, very wealthy. And we see that here in China as well, home of the most billionaires in the entire world, right? Okay, so what does the government do? They tax, and then they redistribute that income. So when they do this, we know that taxation has two main impacts or two main purposes. First, it's just to raise money for the government. The second is to influence economic behavior. And in this case, a progressive tax is used to redistribute income from the very wealthy back to the very poor, to shrink the Lorenz curve down a little bit, to make area A a smaller segment in order to get us closer to equality. So keep in mind there are three types of taxation. The first is a progressive tax, which is actually what the United States has and just about every developed nation has. And this is where the higher income nation pays a higher tax. The lower income, in fact, the first quintile, the most impoverished families, often pay zero tax because they have so little to give, right? Then you have a proportional tax system, and this is where everybody pays the same percentage of their income. So the first quintile, if they only make 10,000, they might pay 10%, right? And we also call that a flat tax. And so they make $10,000, they pay 10%, they pay $1,000 in tax. And then the person pays 100,000 or gets paid 100,000 in income, they pay 10%, so they pay $10,000. So it's still proportional. You're not paying the same rate or the same exact amount, I should say, but you are paying the same rate, the same percentage of your income. Now, some people are against that proportional or flat rate because $1,000 to somebody who makes 10,000 is a bigger deal for that family than it is for someone making 100,000 has to pay 10,000 of their income. They'll be fine on their 90,000. And then finally, I have a regressive tax system, which takes a larger percentage from the poor. We only see this really in kingdoms and dictatorships where somebody who's very, very wealthy, like a king who has political power, uses the taxation of the poor to build their own wealth and status. So we saw that with Russian czars, for example, and we saw that time and time again in medieval Europe. So the fix for income inequality then is actually a progressive tax. The progressive tax is just one part of it, though. You do a progressive tax, you take more money from the rich, and then you take that money and you increase transfer payments to the poor. Transfer payments, remember from like Unit 4, is when the government gives money back to the poor through like welfare, food stamps, healthcare, things of that nature. So they don't actually give them money. It's not like literally take money from here, give money there. It's take money from the very wealthy and then provide more programs for the very poor that help them during their time of poverty. That's a progressive tax, and that's how we shrink the Lorenz curve to be a little more like this with a red line than the big black line here, right? Okay, so keep in mind, whenever we talk about the market failure of income inequality, economists say that the best way to fight income inequality is through progressive taxation and then redistribution of that income. Although there's a political divide here where politically people believe that such a progressive tax does not take into account the merit, right? And merit is really a political debate, not an economic debate, right? It's this idea that, hey, these people earned it because they worked harder, they did these things, they did it right, they won at capitalism. They shouldn't be punished for success. That sends the wrong incentive. So some people are more in line with a flat tax rather than a progressive tax system based on their perception of merit and the role it plays in economic redistribution. Cool. That's it. You did it. Right? So Monday, we're going to review everything. Hopefully that made some sense to you. We'll do a little bit of practice on this, And then Tuesday, I won't see you at all because you're going to be taking the SAT. And then we'll come in Wednesday all rested and zapped, and we'll take the test, and hopefully it'll be fun. All right. Take care, guys.